We could start now, Priksha.
Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to the first thematic panel of the 14th All India Conference of China Studies, organized by the Institute of Chinese Studies, Not Ad University Stiftung. The theme of this panel is titled Cultural Diversity and Identity Formation, and we are very glad to have with us Professor Tejaswini Niranjana as chair. Professor Tejaswini Niranjana is currently Director, Center for Inter-Asian Research and Dean of Online Programs at Ahmedabad University. Formerly, she was Professor and Head of Department of Cultural Studies at Lingnam University, Hong Kong, and Director, Center for Cultural Research and Development. Professor Niranjana is also the founder of the Center for the Study of Culture and Society in Bangalore. For her translations from Kannada into English, she has won the Central Sahitya Academy Award, the Karnataka State Sahitya Academy Award, and the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature. Recently, ma'am won the 2021 National Translation Award for Prose, given by the American Literary Translators Association. We're very glad to have you with us, ma'am. Coming to the discussants for this panel, we have with us Mrs. Poonam Suri and Dr. Rita Agarwal. Mrs. Poonam Suri is adjunct fellow at ICS. She is author, educator, and an independent researcher. Mrs. Suri writes on social welfare in India and China. She has also written on the philosophical underpinnings of civilizations, religions, and contemporary Chinese society. Our second discussant for the session is Dr. Rita Agarwal. Dr. Rita Agarwal is Associate Professor at the Center for East Asian Studies, JNU, and Honorary Fellow at ICS. Formerly, Dr. Agarwal was a visiting scholar to Yunnan Academy of Social Sciences, Kunming, and visiting fellow to the Yunnan Minso University and Yunnan University. Dr. Agarwal is currently engaged in questions of provincial transformations, particularly in Yunnan. We have 4 speakers with us. The speakers will be introduced before the presentations by the chair. But before I invite Professor Tejaswini to begin the proceedings, let me lay out the housekeeping rules. All participants except the speaker will be muted for the duration of the event. Participants are requested to send in their queries via the chat box or use the raise hand option. Please unmute yourself only when the chair calls upon your name. I will now invite Professor Tejaswini to kindly begin the proceedings. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much to all of you at ICS who are taking on the hard responsibility of conducting this for many, many hours each day online. I'm very pleased to be invited to be part of this discussion, and especially to ICS, which I have known about for a long time, but never really visited. Anyway, so I just want to comment on this really interesting fact that all the speakers today have been trained at JNU. Even though they have been from different departments or different centers, schools, whatever. I think it is quite remarkable, and I think it's a feature of the kind of training that JNU is providing for people who want to make a career in Chinese studies. So I'm very glad to be able to listen to these 4 speakers today. As I think the title of the panel itself suggests, all of these speakers are giving us some sort of insight into the question of identities in China today, whether it's to do with religious identities, sexual identities, ethnic minority identities, or diasporic identities. So I look forward very much to having these papers presented. In the order in which I received the bios, let me quickly introduce Biatrisha Mukhopadhyay, who has been alumnus of at several levels at JNU from the time she did a bachelor's degree in Chinese language and literature, having obtained her MPhil in 2019 for her dissertation on ancestor worship and relevant rituals in contemporary Chinese culture. Biatrisha is now working on a PhD at the Center for Chinese and Southeast Asian Studies at JNU. Her research interest areas include Chinese culture and society, folk customs, traditions, religion, and rituals. Biatrisha, over to you.
Hello everyone, I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction, ma'am. First of all, thank you the organizers, AICCS, Vishwa Bharati, and Conrad Adenauer Stiftung for providing with the platform and the opportunity to present and share our ideas for the academic interaction on Chinese studies. So without wasting much time, I'll directly come to the topic of my presentation. Today, I'll share my screen. Am I being able to share my screen?
You want us to share the screen?
Do you not have access, or are you not
I
able to share?
am sharing.
Oh, it's appearing now.
Right now, is it?
Yes, yes, it's coming.
Okay. I hope it's visible, the PPT.
Yes, it is.
Yes.
Okay. So the topic of my today's presentation
please go into
is
full screen mode. Just go into full screen mode.
all right.
It's on the bottom right corner. Yes.
Otherwise, just press F5.
Okay. So the topic of my today's presentation is Intricacies of Religious Identity in China in the Xi era. Now, religion is a much talked about and highly debated topic with context to China. As a scholar in her very initial and primal stages of learning, and with an inquisitive approach towards religion, I have tried to implore the subject of religious identity in China in the recent years under Xi Jinping, and I'm sure with a lot of scope of improvement and suggestion from you all. So, okay, as a student of Chinese language and culture for the past 10 years now, I have often been asked by friends, family, and those with lesser knowledge about China as a country, or those who actually try to figure out what I was actually learning in JNU, that what is the religion of China? What God do they worship? And I kind of always had a very hard time explaining, as it followed with many confusing questions that what about China being a communist state, and are they all Buddhists, and so on. As per official data, we see that the majority of Chinese people adhere to Chinese folk religion, and the rest of the population comprises of people following Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, and other folk sects and organizations. With all the heterogeneous nature of religion in China, the Communist Party has always retained an official stand of being an atheist state, with relaxation of China's policy on religion. Uh, the five recognized religion by the government are Buddhism, Taoism, Islam, Protestantism, and Catholicism. Debate arises when time and again the state has traced back to China's traditional and cultural roots. As religion is intertwined with the traditional and cultural practices, China's own policy of showcasing its cultural and traditional front as one of its primary key to cultural diplomacy in this globalized world. That has become challenging to its atheist stand. To battle such challenges is by ensuring that uh, in, in that all the religious all the interest of these religious association should be in sync with the party goals. On papers, uh, okay, on papers, freedom to religious identity is quite apparent. Although the officially designed law discrimination on the basis of religion and forbids the compelling of citizens to follow any particular religion. It also allows registered organizations to publish literature, possess property, um, train clergies, and even collect donations. However, as it is, the laws have just merely remained on paper. Day by day in the recent times, uh, more so, legal position of religious institutions have been put in a tough spot. Um, Even if we exclude the highly controversial associations that are there in China, there is a rise in curb on various religious groups, activities, and their practices. Even when religiosity saw sharp increase among people within the legal frameworks, um, uh, there are instances of multiple persecutions on the religious front. Uh, the religious mm, of course, they do not have and these religious curbs, they do not have a homogeneous effect on all the religious groups in China. uh, there is distinction. Thus, although the State Council passed regulations on religious affairs, which took place in 2018 or so to allow the state registered religious associations to have certain liberties, but but the revised rules include restrictions on religious schooling and the times and locations of religious celebrations, as well as monitoring of online religious activity and reporting of donation which would exceed 100,000 yuan or so. And these curbs have often resulted in prohibition from celebrating festivals to places of worship being destroyed, violence used as a measure in many parts of the country towards people of certain faith, increased restrictions on children's participation in religious activities, and so on. Uh, Even the party prohibits the party members from holding any religious belief and association to any religious um, association. Here we have a famous journalist, Barbara Dimick. Now, the distinction that I was talking about was how these curbs and persecutions in context with religion differs from different religious groups to different religious groups. Of course, the same is not how uh, certain religious group is being treated, and then there are religion which has been imported from outside China uh, to China, even if thousands of years ago. So here, famous journalist Barbara Dimick, she says Buddhism, Taoism, and other folk religion are seen as most authentically Chinese religion, and there is much more tolerance of these traditional religion than of Islam and Christianity, which is very apparent. And the official stand of the party ideology and religious belief are incongruous. So in 2017, the party's official newspaper also warned Communist Party members from putting faith in any religion, terming it as spiritual anesthesia. Um, and there are reports which find a large population of of the of China adhering to Chinese folk religion. So there is a distinction between how people adhering to Chinese folk tradition and religion are being treated as compared to Islam and those adhering to Islam or Christianity. And then again, further into that, as we see, Buddhism and Taoism were uh, were more easily amalgamated with the Chinese folk religion. So it sees a lesser, of course, not including Tibetan Buddhism. It sees a lesser effect on itself in terms of these religious cults. Uh, the way in which a group or individual adhering to particular religious belief and engaging in its practices is treated is highly dependent on how much threat the parties perceives it as. Under the present leadership, the government has expanded many such practices uh, of persecution, the suppression of the suppression and even of unregistered or even state registered places of worship and religious leaders as well has increased. And
I'm sorry to interrupt, Biatrisha. You have 2 minutes left.
Okay, I'll just
Wind up,
quickly
yeah.
wrap up then. Okay, so the COVID-19 pandemic has worsened the situation because it has given the state a pretext on putting these religious curbs in form of scrutiny. While on one hand, house churches are being raided and looked into, and donations being stopped by churches and certain Buddhist association as well. On the other hand, we have examples like in Wuhan, the two hospitals are being named after Taoist deities, and ritualistic ceremonies such as purifying the land in Wuhan in Taoist temples, those are being allowed. While on the other hand, other religious practices are being labeled as a superstitious influence on the whole society. So, and this has also resulted in persecution on religious literature. There is a new translation of Quran is being imposed with which complies with the uh, state motives, and books on religious content being banned. And in 2018, Holy Bible was banned and taken down from even all the online platforms. And instead of that, the concept of God, if we talk particularly about Christianity, the concept of God and being replaced with the like it was all earlier mentioned, the personality cult thing. So images of Jesus being replaced with images of Xi Jinping. Uh, with all that, this is also termed as China's approach of being one eye closed and one eye open strategy, because on one hand, China's aggrandize its cultural roots and traditions as its cultural diplomatic policy towards all the nations in the world. On the other hand, it has strict curbs on its religious activities. So
I'm sorry, you
to
really have to
reach,
stop now, Biatrisha. Your time is up.
okay, all right.
I'm
So
made
I'll just
a person by the ICS. I'm not the one stopping you.
all right, okay. All right, I'll just conclude it here. It is all right. Thank you.
Could you stop your screen share?
I will.
I know 10 minutes is no time at all, but that's the format. I'm afraid we have to adhere to it. So may I now introduce the second speaker, Mohammad Yasin, who's doing his PhD at the Center for East Asian Studies. What happened? Yeah, I think our recording was off for some reason. I'd like to introduce Mohammad Yasin, who is going to speak to us about the two diasporas, the Pravasi Bharatiya in India and the Huáqiáo-Huárén in China, and talking about how these might be similar or different. Mohammad Yasin is a PhD candidate at the Center for East Asian Studies at JNU. He focuses on the history of China in the United Nations, China's UN policy, and self-image. He's also done his MPhil from the same center, and he's been a visiting fellow at Central China Normal University in Wuhan, in Peking University, and is currently at Harvard AICCS HY Fellowship. Look forward to your presentation, Mohammad Yasin.
Yeah, so good afternoon and good morning to, here it's early morning in Cambridge. So, and thank you, Professor Tejaswini, for your generous introduction. Well, so to begin with, as we are living in the age of globalization and digital transformation, geography no longer dictates identity. Rather, diaspora communities, or what have been deemed lost actors, are the new national assets. So in this new world, India and China represent two emerging Asian giants that share many commonalities, including a large diaspora community. Let me also share the screen here. Yeah. Well, so the combined figure of the two diaspora ranges from 90 to 95 million. So in this very short presentation, what I'm going to do is I'm calling attention to the similarities and differences of these two diasporas, focusing on how the concept of diaspora is perceived by both India and China. And my central argument of the paper is that newness has emerged in two countries' diasporic rapprochement with Prime Minister Modi and General Secretary or President Xi Jinping's ascent to power. It also suggests that the diaspora can be viewed beyond the lens of remittances and financial flows, and India can proactively optimize its strategic goals by prioritizing policy responses to protect the interest of the diaspora community, as well as getting institutional apparatus on track. And finally, to demonstrate that both countries seek to vigorously cultivate emotional citizenship, despite diaspora policies of India and China are broadly convergent in nature, and an active re-engagement process is in sight. The homogenization of Chinese diaspora and Hinduizing Indian diaspora may not reap the full potential. Okay, so in my paper, I have revisited the very concept of diaspora. So what I'm going to do is to skip this part of diaspora literature review as there is time constraint, but definitely I can take up it in the Q&A session if someone is interested. So, but very quickly, the term diaspora is derived from the Greek word diasporian, which means dispersion or distribution, a concept employed by many ethnic groups in the past and now, originally used in the 3rd century BCE to denote the dispersion and distribution of the Jewish diaspora. So overall, over the decades, the definition of diaspora involves, though imprecisely at times, an individual or group belonging to a specific country with a common origin or community or culture, but residing outside their homeland for numerous reasons. Nojaks writes that Pravasi Bharatiya includes both non-resident Indians and people with Indian origins. And then Pravasi Bharatiya are understood in 3 categories by the Indian political system. Number one is that NRI, the non-resident Indians, temporary workers primarily concentrated in the Gulf Cooperation Council, NRIs and persons of Indian origins in Australia, Canada, Europe, and the US, and also New Zealand, and again PIOs in countries such as Fiji, Mauritius, Malaysia, Singapore, South Africa, and so on, where immigration took place roughly 150 years ago. And again, the 3rd category is often referred to as the old diaspora. According to official documents, overseas Chinese are divided into 3 categories. Chinese nationals, including those from Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Macau, residing outside China are viewed as Huáqiáo-Huárén are those Chinese who naturalized abroad or are foreign citizens, but from Chinese descent or ethnicity. And again, Huai are those born abroad and of Chinese bloodline and heritage. However, the categories are not always mutually exclusive. For instance, Huáqiáo and Huárén together are referred to as a Qiaopao, and those immigrated after 1978 are called Xinqiao or Xinyi, meaning new immigrants. Indian and Chinese traders. If we here track the histories of China and Indian diaspora communities, we see that Indian and Chinese traders have had business links with other countries for centuries. Though traditionally the major chunk of Indian and Chinese diaspora communities lived in Southeast Asia, the post-World War II political scenario reshuffled the immigration process, both geographically and demographically. Now, young, skilled, rich, and professional Asian immigrants increasingly headed to North America and other developed countries of the West. Again, this part of historicities of both Indian and Chinese diaspora communities, I have done it extensively in my paper, and again, I can take it up in the Q&A session if anyone is interested. Economic policies of so India and China both have social, cultural, and linguistic complications that make offering common insights rather challenging. However, throughout their histories, both have experienced considerable immigration, and immigrants' financial help, of course, in different ways, has benefited the development of homeland economic reforms and late industrialization. So in India, India collected some 83.1 billion US dollar remittances, and these remittances as a share of GDP stands at 3.1% in 2020, whereas China collects 59.1 billion US dollars remittances as share of GDP. And again, its share of GDP is 0.4% in 2020. So now, one of the central arguments of this paper is that the fresh rapprochements with President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi's ascent to power. And here, let me also quickly read the quote by Mr. Modi, very quickly, there are over 30 million overseas Indians living abroad. Their footprints are all over the world. Indians abroad are valued not for their strength in numbers, they are respected for their contributions to India and societies where they live in. In foreign lands and communities across the globe, the Indian diaspora represents our values, Indian values. They are hardworking, law-abiding, and peace-loving, and are role models for other countries. As Indians, we have a common heritage that brings us together. We may be around the globe, but it is the common bond that makes us strong. Again, in a similar fashion, General Secretary or President Xi Jinping in 2018 proposed the united and unified Chinese nation is the common root of the Chinese sons and daughters at home and abroad, and the broad and profound Chinese culture is the common soul of the Chinese sons and daughters at home and abroad. Overseas Chinese have an irreplaceable important role in realizing the Chinese dream, closely unite the vast numbers of overseas Chinese and returned overseas Chinese and their relatives, and give full play to their role in the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. It is important. It is important task of the party and the country and the country. So, as these statements illustrate, both India and China, emerging Asian nations with large populations at home and abroad, recognize the importance of their overseas populations and the influence they exert. So,
2 minutes left, Mohammad Yasin, 2 minutes left, please.
Okay. So after assuming office, even prior to PM Modi's ascent to power, his party, Bharatiya Janata Party, even from the release of election manifesto, perceived the Indian diaspora as an asset and stressed on the need to reboot India's global strategic engagement. And to realize this goal, Prime Minister Modi reached out to the Indian diaspora through mega events and also by launching a string of initiatives and repackaging some existing schemes. In 2015, PIOs and and OCI, Overseas Citizenship of India cardholders were merged under one category, which is again Overseas Citizenship of India. The same year, PM again announced Bharat Ko Janiye, No India program, and also Pravasi Tirth Darshan Yojana. Xi Jinping, during his stint as the party secretary of Fujian province, remarked, in the new era, overseas Chinese work must have a new concept, a new train of thought. So, the citizenship and associated rights, India and China do not entertain their diaspora with dual citizenship. Although it is assumed that democracies are more likely to accept dual citizenship, it did not happen with India for different reasons, and I can talk about the reasons in the Q&A session. So today, although it was built and passed in Lok Sabha, but it was again blocked in Rajya Sabha, so the voting rights for NRIs thus remain a pipe dream. Given its authoritarian political setup, this direct political participation doesn't apply to overseas Chinese. And yeah, so
I'm afraid we're out of time.
Yeah, very quickly. So institutionally, there is difference in India, MEA, and the Ministry of Overseas Indian Affairs. And there's also so many other institutions are housed in MEA, but whereas China actually conducts all its diaspora affairs through 5 institutions. And there is also emotional connect, both the countries are trying to pitch in. And then again, regime type. So democracy and then authoritarian government, there's also differences. But again, there are 2 irritants in this approach. So one is homogenization of Chinese, and also the overseas. There's also alleged role of Chinese institutions there is alleged role for intelligence sharing, collecting, and some spying on its overseas populations. So
completely out of time, Yasin.
That's my conclusion, that while strategies are comprehensive and sometimes convergent in nature, India needs to amplify its efforts by expanding existing programs and introducing some new ones. However, embracing their diverse, old, and highly skilled professionals would definitely make India and China stronger, culturally enriching, and even more relevant in world politics and on the stage of global storytelling. Thank you.
Thank you, and apologies again. We'll now have the third speaker. The third speaker is Dr. Kaustubh Padmapati, who's an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science in the Royal School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Royal Global University in Guwahati. He is also JNU trained like all the others on this panel. He has a PhD and MPhil in American Studies from SIS at JNU. His research areas include China, Taiwan, East Asia and Southeast Asia, ASEAN, US foreign policy, international relations, gender and alternative sexuality. Professor Padmapati. Go ahead, please.
Yes. Hope I'm audible, ma'am. Okay. Thank you so much, Chair, for giving me the opportunity for presenting my particular paper. And thank you, ICS. My association with ICS goes long back when I was working in Ananta Aspan Center. We have jointly done China Symposia long time back. But for the first time, I'll be presenting here paper as a scholar. So I'd request a host to share my PPT.
Just a second, I'm sharing it.
Sure, sure.
you like to continue speaking, Professor Padmapati, to save time while they
Sure,
get...
sure, ma'am. Sure, ma'am. Sure. Okay. Thank you. So, my topic for today's presentation is democratic transitions, new Taiwanese identity, and queer rights movement in Taiwan, assessing the linkages. So, of course, I'll be moving away from the mainland China because I'm a researcher of Taiwan, and my PhD was also on Taiwan. However, this is a completely new topic that I picked up because it's a very fascinating, because first of all, Taiwan is a democracy and it's a small island based in Western Pacific. And I think everybody knows that PRC, People's Republic of China, consider Taiwan as a part of its territory. And the recent development that is going on is basically about claiming Taiwan sovereignty, that well known. And also the United States of America also plays a very crucial role in the political status of the Taiwan. Why I selected this particular topic, because first of all, Taiwan is a young democracy in East Asia, but it offers a very pluralistic and inclusive experience to its residents. It is a very vibrant democracy, new one, and also its performances in different fields like gender equity, inclusiveness is really, really interesting. Next slide, please. So the Taiwan's democratic transitions, it's quite new, started on in the 1980s onwards, and being a democracy, it offers a pluralistic and inclusive experience to its residents. And surprisingly, it's one of the strongest gender equitable liberal democracies in Asia. It ranks 9th currently, much above the mainland China, Japan, Singapore, other East Asian countries. So citizens of Taiwan also embraced enthusiastically human rights and the multiculturalism based on the principle of self-determination. And the biggest achievement of Taiwan that I have to say, it is the first Asian country that legalized same-sex marriage, because considering the Asian societies which are very conservative in terms of same-sex marriage, so Taiwan's bold step is really commendable. Next slide. So my research objective basically, so whenever I was doing all the research and all, we can find, because of the democratizations, two very important outcomes. The first one is basically the emergence of a new Taiwanese identity and a strong movement for feminist and LGBTQ rights. And the main objective is to study the theoretical and conceptual framework of development of liberal democracy, democratic principles in Taiwan, and to critically examine the emergence of new Taiwanese identity in the context of cross-strait and democratic transitions, to examining continuing response of Taiwanese society towards LGBTQ rights and the same-sex marriage, and to attempt to find the correlations between development of democracy, new Taiwan identity, and the queer. Next slide. The research plan of this particular paper, I try to find out a few specific questions like the significant, queer movement and LGBT one. I'll just, because of the time, I'll just move to my main arguments. So of course, Taiwan emerged during the third wave of democracy, as advocated by Samuel P. Huntington in his book. And it really fascinating, because Taiwan democratic transition process was quite unique, because even the authoritarian government, the KMT, also took the part of these transitions. It started with the process replacing the martial law with democratically acceptable national security law and civil organization. Important outcome of this democratization process is the creation of a new Democratic Party, DPP, Democratic Progressive Party, who is currently in power, and they are all the torch bearers of feminist and the LGBTQ movements. It is really interesting. Taiwan transition from democracy, from authoritarian to democracy was quite smooth. It was not like violent in many countries. And slowly, why it happened? Because a new generation of the Taiwanese who have not much connection with the mainland China took over the initiatives. And this and they are so various reforms were introduced, civil society got very powerful, and people became aware of their identity and their human rights. And many key institutions that were supporting the authoritarian government were replaced with a new form of rural institutions. Many elections also. Elections had a huge role because elections were there still in 1949. So one of the main reasons that, that opposition forces that appeared from these elections. Now, I'm really going fast because of so many things to cover. Because of the process, everyone witnessed a new identity. It became a complex matter as the identity of Taiwan developed out of history and culture shared with mainland China. However, the identity has been altered and changed through the experience of the island resident under different political systems. So Kuomintang KMT basically used to follow the Chinese identity, the Confucian identity. They try to impose it or impose that it on. However, DPP was always opposed to that particular identity, and they stand for the new Taiwanese identity. So according to Dr. Cheng Yan-sai, defined Taiwan identity as a multi-dimensional and multi-layered collective identity based on collective awareness and common history and devoted to preserve at all costs. So a lot of sociologists like Frank Munyard and all, they all try to identify this unique identity and how as images, basically. Now, so this new identity was basically saying no to the Chinese identity. And we can find the clear distinctions between the Taiwanese and the Chinese. While the first one is more territorial, political, and subjective and psychological criteria, and the Chinese identity was more about primordial and the cultural criteria. And Taiwan's prolongs political and economic distance from mainland.
Professor Padmapati, you have 2 minutes left.
Okay. So of course, the new identity of Taiwan's DPP or DPP played a huge role in creating this particular identity. We can find a different status quo and the native Taiwanese identity. And can you come to the feminist and the queer movement part? Yeah. So with all these political changes, we can also see a clear, a huge difference in the Taiwanese society. And first, it's the feminist movement. A lot of feminist organizations came into existence. So the first wave of Taiwanese movement started in 1990s. And their main idea is to reform various laws and make it a gender equal. So the strong feminist movement created the path for a strong LGBTQ movement. They created, that is the second wave that we can talk about. It started with the Pride and a lot of NGOs and the civil society that supported, that basically came out from this feminist and the queer movement. They supported each other. And some of the very important contributions of this collaboration, we can see 4 important acts. The HIV infection and the control of the patients act, that known as the AIDS Prevention Act, Act of Gender Equality in Education, act of gender equality in employment, and the same sex and the legalization marriage. So if trying to access the the connectivity, 2-3 factors definitely contributed. First, of course, new generation of Taiwanese emerged during the democratic process. Second, a very equitable and gender neutral education.
I'm really
Because
sorry,
act
your
of-
time is up.
Okay, ma'am. Okay, so basically that is the connection I try to look at, and a lot of things has to be said. So maybe I can answer during my Q&A. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you. Yeah.
I know I began by thanking ICS, but I'm now wondering who to blame for the position that I'm in, that all I do is cut people off. So my apologies again. The last speaker of today's panel is Daweru Lanamay, currently assistant professor in Chinese at the Department of Foreign Languages and a research scholar at the Department of Cultural Studies at Tezpur University in Assam. She's also trained at JNU, and her publications are basically on parallels and contrasts in the popular folklore of the Chinese and the Nagas. All yours, Daweru Lanamay.
Thank you, Chair. And I would also like to extend my gratitude to the organizers for giving me this opportunity. And I have titled my presentation as Synthesizing Naming Practices of Select Ethnic Minorities in China. And I will attempt to examine how identity is constructed through personal names and naming practices, and try to understand the impact of Han culture and language in the naming practices of ethnic groups in China. And to begin with, we may agree that names for people, things, or place are used in every known society, and names are essential elements of beinghood and identity, and can also locate people's genealogy, social and public networks, kingdoms, and also reflect hierarchy of social status. So now, so it is vital for us to understand names beyond its lexical meaning and see how it is embedded, or what is embedded in the name. For instance, personal names carry a great deal of information like gender, race, social status, memories, expectations, events at the time of birth, etc. Therefore, names are terminologies which correspond for cultural entities on account of their assignation on particular barriers, well received by a society where members have some understanding of who or what it is to which the name belongs. Now, we also believe that naming is a political act because it is always done to achieve or establish something else. Conferring a name on someone or something amounts to assigning a subject position to that person. And through the act of naming, the individual is converted into a boy or a girl, a member of a particular ethnic group or a clan, or even a particular class. So we can assume that the process of naming is never innocent. And further, to be able to name someone or something indicates one's control over that person or thing. For this presentation, I have conveniently selected 3 minority groups out of the 55 officially recognized ethnic groups in People's Republic of China, and they belong to different language families and different geographical regions. I have selected the Mongols, who mainly resides in Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region and who speaks Mongolian languages. Mongolian language that belongs to Altai family. The next is Tibetan, who are mostly based in Tibetan Autonomous Region, speaking Tibetic language that belongs to Sino-Tibetan language family. And finally, Hua people who are based in Yunnan province and who speaks Hua language that belongs to Austro-Asiatic language family. These 3 groups illustrates the complex identification practice of China's ethnic minority groups, and they represent the variants characterizing minorities in China. With distinct language, religion, and cultural variation among them, a comparative analysis of their naming practices provides a broad view of their culture through names and naming practices. And I'm using content analysis method by reviewing literatures available on names and naming practices of the selected groups. Like I'm looking into literatures like journals and books, statistical yearbooks, travelogues, magazines, newspaper, websites, blogs, etc. So going through the literature review, and I have compiled how naming practices works in these three groups. So works on Mongolian names mainly discusses the fluidity of naming practices, various beliefs and factors involved in selecting a personal name. They also mention about the socio-cultural changes, allegories, structural changes, and spiritual elements embedded in Mongolian names, and some common traditions followed by the Mongols in bestowing a name to a child are naming of a child based on the first thing the mother saw after childbirth, events occurring on childbirth or during naming, after historical figures, after weekdays of when the child is born, religious names and names with good meanings. And it is observed that after the introduction of Buddhism among the Mongols, Mongolian names became more knitted with the religion and with Tibetan and Sanskrit languages. And since the 1921, Russian influence can be seen in Mongolian names. However, despite having long enforced association among the Mongols and Chinese, few elements of Chinese names can be seen in Mongolian names. Coming to the Tibetan names, richer collection of academic writings and research works are found on Tibetan names and naming practices. Various sources on Tibetan names, both on English and Chinese, focuses mainly on how names are assigned, situation leading to change in names and gender specification. Traditionally, a child can be named after the day of the birth, after a famous lama, or names that are derived from parts of parents' names. And it is very interesting to note that gender identification in Tibetan names can be made through syllable length. For example, only male names have 5 to 6 syllables. And in the recent time, since the post-liberation period, acquiring of Chinese names among the Tibetans are also on the rise. The final group that I'm looking into, the Hua people from Yunnan, they remain the most isolated and least explored in terms of research materials, particularly on names and naming practices. And some available literature explores how naming is embedded in cultural, historical, and linguistic contexts of the Hua people. And for them, memorized genealogies of the personal names of successive lineage serves as a historical memory of heroic moves across the landscape, linking the names of the newly claimed places with each associated ancestor. And children in each family are enumerated by 9 birth order terms that combine with the name of the weekday of the birth to form the name of a person. And the people of Hua, they usually do not change their names, except when a child encounters accident or disease. And this finds similarity with Tibetan name changing process. And names are chosen for ease of pronunciation and nice sound among the Hua people. And names referring to an event or circumstance at the time of birth discloses the social values attached in naming. And it also can be seen that the widespread adaptation of Chinese words as Hua names is a current trend observed in Hua naming practices. Now, coming to the signification of ethnic minorities through multiple medium, we can say that signification is not a new phenomena, and this policy has been in place since ancient times, where large numbers of Han people from the north migrated to south, integrating with various ethnic groups residing there. And in recent times, signification of ethnic minorities in China has become more prominent, following the initiative undertaken by the government in modernization and preserving of ethnic minority groups, assigning of Han Chinese names with the help of teachers in schools, and use of Han Chinese style transliterated surnames for administrative purposes are few examples of signification through language and names. And names being an integral part of language and illustrations of how significant language plays in naming of the ethnic groups it becomes inevitable to argue how imposition of Mandarin or Chinese language poses a threat for minorities' language and culture. And likewise, like the naming practices of the Wa, the Tibetan and the Mongols and also other various ethnic minority groups, the process of giving a formal name requires considerable thought even for among the Han Chinese. And naming practices of Han Chinese are based on the characteristics of Han Chinese culture, language, and writing system. So it is evident from this that culture and language are the foundation of names and meaning for every culture, irrespective of being a majority or a minority. So in China, though there are 53 ethnic minority groups who have their distinct language, many of them have adopted Han Chinese naming patterns and naming practices.
Then 2 minutes left.
Okay. Then the next thing that comes about the signification is the development of standardized system for input of names of minorities in China. And because it is built conveniently based on Han Chinese naming style with maximum 3 to 4 characters. And it is also not worthing that the huge differences in Mandarin and minority language phonology and also differences in writing style. Representation of writings of minorities in Mandarin Chinese seem absurd as the sounds and meaning cannot be precise. The third point is on the promotion of Mandarin language, like the news reports on of protest in Inner Mongolia against the promotion of integration of this transition of language from Mongolian to Mandarin in Chinese clearly shows how assimilation to majority Han culture is on the rise and poses a risk of losing ethnic culture and language, diminishing the notion of defining China as a multi-ethnic, multicultural nation. And in conclusion, I would like to mention that this paper is a modest attempt to highlight the unique and vibrant culture of naming practices followed by different ethnic groups in China and the risk they face in signification of their language and culture. Because it has to be understood that the Chinese government at different levels are actively involved in promotion and preservation of this minority language and culture. And with such guiding principles, but the evidence and effectiveness of such benefits are quite vague. So it is necessary to have an in-depth study on cultural markers such as names and naming practices to document, preserve, conserve, and sustain the cultural uniqueness of these ethnic minority groups. With this, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you so much. Could you stop the screen share, please?
Sure.
Yeah, so let me at least take this chance to congratulate all of you on your most interesting presentations. And let me raise some very small questions for each one of you, if I can. The first one is for Biatrisha. I found it interesting that you were focusing mostly on how the nation state in China deals with the question of religion in terms of regulating, narrowing down the possibilities and everything that's been happening in the last few years. I'm very curious, knowing there's a really vibrant internet citizenry in China, I'm very curious as to how the citizens are responding to this and whether their attempt to deal with the whole religion issue is somewhat different from how the nation state does it. So that's my first question. The second is to Mohammad Yasin. I was curious as to what it might mean to historicize your question about the diaspora in both India and China. I myself have worked on the Indian diaspora in the Caribbean, and I know that you use the term old diaspora. So I want to ask you, is that merely a diaspora from an earlier period, or is it also qualitatively different? These were not immigrants, as you suggested, but they were indentured laborers who migrated to certain parts of the world in the 1850s. I've called them the subaltern diaspora, and I think there's a huge difference there. So I'm just wondering whether the discourse, whether in China or India, of diaspora associated with longing, with loss, with nostalgia, is somehow covering over the serious issues of class, and in India of caste and religion, that are quite significant in how we understand contemporary diaspora versus the older ones. In China, for example, for centuries now, Chinese peoples have been going to many parts of the world, especially Southeast Asia. And there is a sense that they're part of a larger polity, right? So the way in which China deals with the diaspora, many of them came back to China in the 40s to help the new state to come into existence. There's a huge amount of presence of that. And subsequently in Southeast Asia, when, with Japanese colonialism, with the British and the other Europeans, receding from that part of the world, many of the communist insurgents in Southeast Asia were supported not so much by the Chinese state, but by certain connections that people had already established. Anyway, these are many layered diasporas. And I think personally, it would be a pity if you were to just look at the present and try to explain what is happening with the diaspora only in terms of state policy or in terms of how this might pan out for India and China as nation states. Again, it's a nation state question. I come from a space where I try to be more skeptical about the nation state. So hence this question. To Kaustubh Padmapati, I know something about Taiwan, and I find it a bit odd that you should say they have very little connection with mainland China, because even if you look at the reality of Taiwanese life, there are all kinds of, it's not just the historical connection, but a very contemporary set of connections that do exist. There is, marriage migration from mainland China into Taiwan, for example. There are several million Taiwanese living in a place like Shanghai. They come back to Taiwan to vote in the elections, but they live on the mainland. Many other examples that we won't go into. So I felt somehow that maybe you could have spoken about the Cold War and the role of the United States in the emergence of the democratic idea of Taiwan. I found this missing because it seemed a very, just to make in a lighter vein, a DPP view of Taiwan politics. I hope you won't take that amiss, but maybe explore that. To Daveru Lanamay, I don't have any very profound question, but I was curious again as to how, I know the nation state is dealing with this problem in this way, and this larger process of homogenizing happens in all societies and has happened historically, even in China. There are more than 70 languages, but no one really encourages them to speak up, etc. So I just want to know, how is it on the ground? Because I think we read too much into the policy of the nation state. And I'm very curious as to how people deal with this on a daily basis. Do they have one name for their passport and one name at home or whatever? I think one needs to look at the intersections of this so-called homogenization more carefully. Thank you all, and thank you again for a very lively set of presentations. I wonder if you would like to begin by quickly responding to these and then taking the questions from the audience.
Ma'am, could I intervene?
Go ahead, just do it in the order in which you presented. I won't speak up.
Ma'am, can I intervene?
Oh, sorry, yeah, go ahead, Preksha.
Ma'am, before we give a chance to the speakers to address the comments, could we go to the discussants?
Oh, I'm so sorry. I was in the other panel which didn't have discussants. I simply assumed that this was it. My deep apologies to the discussants, whom I cannot see on the screen. Yes, of course.
Suri and Dr. Rita Agarwal.
Many apologies.
Poonam Suri.
Okay. So I think I will be discussing the first two papers, which is what I've been told by the AICCS. And respected Chair, thank you for remembering to call me in. So, this is a very complicated topic, but it's a very good paper. I must say it's been aptly described in the paper. The communist state like China, the role of religion is quite complicated. It's always the nation and religion which have contestations and negotiations, and the two concepts of nationalist and religious identities are merged and overlap each other in a lot of ways. And that has been well described in the paper. Very often, the religious identities have been blurred by the needs of the time. So when I spoke to a lot of people in China, some people go to Confucian temples because their children have exams. Some go to Taoist temples because they need to touch the statue of an horse, and that makes them, they believe that will cure them. Some go to Buddhist temples because the god of medicine will help to, cure their families. So it's all a question of the needs of the time. But the restrictions put on religious groups and the monitoring are all a part of the maneuvering of the party state to suit its own purposes, which is to stay in power. Using religion and philosophy to benefit the party, Confucianism and its innate culture that emphasizes moral and ethical values, filial piety, frugal living, and non-profit motives. These values of benevolence, ethics, and community living benefit the party state. But quite clearly, Confucianism is not the ideology of the party. Because as we know in Confucianism, if the people do not like the ruler, they have the right to just pull him down. Where Buddhism is concerned, the peace and harmony suits the party, and the Sangha, filled with bodhisattvas and peace-loving entities, is a plus point, as are the charity organizations and the donations for natural catastrophes. And most importantly, the cultural soft power and diplomacy, which, as we know, a lot of you might be knowing, is even helping the India-China diplomacy. There has been a temple set up near Loyang, which was the first Buddhist temple in the country. This is the Indian-style Buddhist shrine, which was set up and inaugurated by Pratibha Patil in 2010. And that has been designed by Indian architects and engineers. So this is one of the diplomacy initiatives. And also with the other Southeast Asian countries, although we know that Theravada Buddhism, which is more popular in the Southeast Asian countries, is not that popular in China. It's Mahayana Buddhism. So there is a bit of a restraint on that part of cultural diplomacy. But we know that there have been a lot of restrictions, that we understand that the party is supreme and that is what they want to do to be in power. So the Dharungar Monastery in Sichuan province was demolished, cut to size, and a lot of people were removed from there, monks and nuns, and were moved to other temples. This was one of the very important Tibetan monasteries. And in 2018, the Shaolin Temple, which is the heart of the Chan Buddhism, with Bodhidharma coming in from India, they were told to fly the national flag, thus merging the religious and national identities. And all religious places must fly the national flag, is from what I understand. Now, where Buddhism is concerned, it is obviously one of the favored religions of the party, but we need to remember something. If we look at the history, there is a Buddhist teacher called Hu Yuan, who belonged to the era of Kumarajiva, who was one of the supreme translators of Buddhism for China. And this was from 350 to 430 AD. Kumarajiva was there. And he has written something on why no monk should bow to the emperor. So if we link it to the contemporary scenario, and if the religion becomes so powerful, then the party will be in danger. So there are all kinds of contestations. Hu Yuan set up a temple in Jiangxi province in Lushan. And when I visited it, this was very apparent that the history was linked to the contemporary scenario. China wants to be the center of the Buddhist world, which is what they said to me. And hence Buddhism is a religion which is quite acceptable, but it has also become very materialistic, and all kinds of, there are all kinds of people who are blaming the Buddhist, that there's become more of a tourist industry because of all the pilgrimages. The temple spaces are used to garner money. Monks and heads of temples have been criticized for becoming rich and using the temples for personal advantages. However, during the pandemic, the Buddhist organizations, because of the online prayer ceremonies for the sick or dying people, have been fulfilling the purpose of the party and not letting crowds collect at temples and other religious places, which might have proved a threat to the party. The party boss of Qinghai province, the birthplace of the Dalai Lama, said Tibetans who live there had been saying that they view Xi Jinping as a deity. Wang Gusheng said General Secretary Xi Jinping is a living bodhisattva. So there are all kinds of very interesting things coming up. We need to think of the future of religion in China. On the one hand, as rightly put, it is spiritual anesthesia and provides calm and peace in the materialistic setting of today's world. And on the other hand, the globalization and diffusing of identities in terms of religions and ethnic terms is bound to happen and will keep increasing. Hence, the diffusion, together with the need for tradition and spirituality, make a very complex scenario which can be discussed ad nauseum. So I think Tibetan Buddhism is becoming more popular, and that is not liked by the party. The tolerance of religions is based on the threat they pose to the party. Sinicization of religions can take a new turn, as stated in the paper. In the past, it has been simplified. The Pure Land Buddhism and Chan Buddhism has now merged, and a very simple solution in which all people should chant Nami Amitofo, which is Namo Amitabh, so that it can be chanted by people to get the Sangh in a moral mode. Rightly stated, a new form of sinicization of Buddhism might be in the making to suit the party interests. In conclusion, soft power diplomacy, cultural and religious identity, and the party interests are complex issues that need to be explored as time goes on, and the party's stance changes according to its needs. The most important one being to keep religion in check and use it to stay in power. And last of all, at my recent trip to China, Kuan Yin, the goddess of mercy, is now being shown as a deity which is encouraging people to have more children. Now that the 3-child policy has been announced, Kuan Yin holding a baby is a sign that all Buddhists should be encouraged, or all people should be encouraged to have more children. Otherwise, Kuan Yin is shown as holding a willow branch in one hand and a small jar in the other, holding the nectar of well-being. So that speaks for itself. I don't know how much time I have to discuss the other paper. Is it all right?
I have to ask Preksha. I'm afraid I'm not in control.
Yes, please ask her.
Ma'am, you have about 4-5 minutes.
Okay, I'll be very quick about this. So this is the paper by Yasin, and it is very relevant, very interesting. And we know that how important the diaspora is to both countries. Huge numbers of people are living abroad, and they are contributing to the economy by sending remittances, which help people increase their consumption and thus contribute to the economy. But the thing about the diaspora is, what comes to my mind is strangers at home, always a foreigner. So it's a very complicated issue again, identity of the diaspora. Or for Indians as well as Chinese, there are cultural borderlands. Many may not fully identify themselves as either with the host country or the motherland. But another question, very interesting question, is how is the ethnic, religious identity of Chinese diaspora perceived by themselves as compared to the Chinese nationalist identity? Has globalization diffused the ethnic and religious identity to a level where a Chinese citizen is a Chinese when he or she is in another country? Or how does the party state view these sections of the diaspora? If I were an Uyghur and I were in a foreign country, would I consider myself just as a Chinese, or would I look at myself with my ethnic identity? These are questions which we need to explore and which are very interesting. And also we have to remember that the current new Chinese and Indian migrants belong to the intellectual elite with a preference to migrate to Western industrialized countries and want to find jobs in emerging marketplaces, or to simply find a better environment with a better quality of life for their children. Whether the call of the motherland will be a pull factor needs to be examined and will keep changing over time. So I'm just going to be very brief because I know we have other things that we need to have the other discussant as well. So, and for China, the overseas Chinese are also very useful in the sense that they have a deep understanding of the local situations, which run businesses, so that they can act as guides and go-betweens and participants in the BRI initiative as well, and to bolster global standing of China. So the diaspora is extremely important, and we need to keep that in mind. Also, we need to consider those nationals, Chinese nationals, who were forced to leave the motherland and have sought asylum in other countries, whether they have a negative role to play in the cultural diplomacy or soft power is another issue that can be addressed. And the tensions with the indigenous population. This is a downside of the influence and power of Chinese and Indian business organizations. There are other issues, transnational intermarriages, patterns and trends of Chinese students returning to China, coming to study in China from abroad, family migration, feminization of diaspora, trying to attract the brain pack back, thus the 1,000 Talents program. And there are lots of programs to entice Chinese youth to come and visit the country so that they can feel a part of the whole community. And it is interesting and relevant to explore how the definition and concept of diaspora will keep changing as we look at them. Okay, I think I should stop at that.
Thank you.
So much, and may I invite Dr. Rita Agarwal now to make her comments.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think I'll be brief so that also the presenters may get some more time to respond to the lot of interesting questions which have been raised by the Chair as well as by my other discussant. First, I also begin by congratulating the presentations on democratic transition, Taiwan identity, and queer activism in Taiwan, which I thought is a very interesting paper because the kind of linkages the author is trying to put together and came up with this idea of that how democratic transformation has led to a kind of a queer activism, which I found very fascinating. So I congratulate Costa Padmavati for thinking of these linkages in his paper and talking about that how transformation may lead to a local indigenous identity and in then return can lead to a kind of a new civil society activism where you have this formation of queer activism in Taiwan. So this is linkage is very informative and analytical, and I found he analyzed the role of political party in Taiwan, and basically the point which I want him to explore further is that do you think that the process of this new Taiwan identity and also the queer activism in Taiwan is purely a localization process, or is it also a response to a kind of a global phenomena which is actually very much there as it is? So from reading his paper, one get an impression that he basically trying to talk about that how the indigenous or localization process is lead to a kind of a new activism, which is basically seen in the case of LGBTQ rights, and it is mainly a localization process. So I want him to respond to think about it, whether it was also a response to a global movement as such. Second paper by Lanamay, which again I found very fascinating in the sense that how she tried to combine and think about this process of naming practices of ethnic minorities in China and the way it is trying to bring the idea of co-opting or assimilating or integrating these ethnic minorities into this Han Chinese nationalism. So, and she goes on to talk about, that how naming is a more of a power negotiation practices. And she very well selected the case studies of 3 important ethnic minorities basically living in frontiers of China, which have been given some kind of a autonomous regions right in the beginning, but later on, of course, there are a lot of problems with those issues. So my, the common thread which I found in both the papers are somewhere there is an urge for recognition. So there is urge for identity movement, which have been in a way challenged to a kind of a, the process of co-opting and process of integrating, which goes on, especially in case of ethnic minorities in Han, in China. And the interesting point is that how these 2 papers actually dealt with these kind of issues in one, Taiwan, which is fairly democratic society, and second in China, which has been referred as a communist multiculturalism by Susan McCarthy, which of course she also talked about in her work. So the whole idea is that this urge for recognition, which you see in both the cases, both in Taiwan and in China. And also there's somewhere, the desire to resist. I mean, there's a movement to resist against this kind of an infringement, which has happened in case of a identity formation in both the cases. So you have this, the infringement of queer rights, and which have been resisted, but in a case of a movement, as well as you have this infringement of identity practices in case of ethnic minorities in Yunnan, which also have been in a way resisted by the ethnic minorities in different ways. So my question is to her is basically how you trying to problematize this concept of signification, because the China has this history of signification of Marxism, which has been taken in much more positive manner. So in this kind of a case study, when you're taking up the signification of naming practices, are you in a way linking it with this kind of a Hanization? So if you take sinicization in this case of naming practices, are you linking it with the Hanization? So are you basically saying the Chinese basically means is a Hanization process, which they try to integrate and link it through this kind of a naming practices? So these are my, two short comments to these paper, writers, which they can respond, and the common thread which they follow. So I leave it to the now paper presenters to speak and to the chair to decide.
So Preksha, we have less than 10 minutes, right? Preksha, how do we divide this up?
Yes, ma'am. So according to the technical team, we could go on for a little over 10 minutes, maybe 12 minutes.
Okay, so can I invite the speakers to just say something for a minute or so each? Please keep your answers very short. I'm sorry, you've dealt with pretty complex responses from the two discussants, and I also threw in some questions. So see if you can respond in a minute. And then we will leave some space for other questions from the audience. In the order of presentations, could you please just respond?
Yes, so I'll go first. With to the response to Tejaswini ma'am's question, I'd like to say that how I said the treatment of different religious groups in China differ, like the treatment that they receive from the state. So it is different from those adhering to the Chinese folk religion and Buddhism and Taoism, which has already been sinicized, and to that of Islam and Christianity. And I believe that the room left for the Chinese citizen to identify themselves with in context to religion has been shrinking under the identification of the party propagated national identity. So even though has been a try to push through it, it has been difficult. So they try to maintain it within the legal framework that the party provides. And for Christianity, if I speak, even though it does not fall under certain legal frameworks, they operate in secrecy, which obviously does not yield healthy repercussions. So yeah, I would like to conclude. Thank you.
Yeah, so to the question of Professor Tejaswini's the old diaspora and all these things. So basically my argument is that although it has been it has the roots since the first, second century BCE, but again we see the kind of acceleration in terms of following the reforms and opening up period in China in 1978, and also after the economic liberalization policy in 1991 in India. So, I think centuries back, so there was one Sangam literature, which is Patina Pallai. There has the roots of during Chola period, Chola kingdom. There was like the South Indian traders were actually based in Southeast Asian countries, and then so. But again, if we move to the British colonial the time, so Indians feel labor needs, everything from plantation workers, soldiers like sepoys, sailors, laskars, dock workers, or nannies, ayahs, to clerks in the civil services of the British Empire. While the unskilled, as you rightly mentioned, the indentured workers enrolled to work overseas in the colonies. So, but again, after the Nationalist Congress Party had campaigned for the treatment of Indian diaspora community in the British dominions, and but there's also some point of ambiguity, which is that Indian government favored turning a blind eye. Notably, in 1963, Burmese General Nowin nationalized all businesses, which resulted in the loss of livelihoods and expulsion of as many as 300,000 Indians. So, but again, we see that the major policy adjustment happened after 2002 Sanghi committee reports. And then again, in 2003, the Pravasi Bharatiya Divas, the Overseas Indian Day, was so that is also the point. And so the new diaspora and then old diaspora. And again, this is the old 150 years ago, which migration happened. They are called old diaspora. This is basically, I quoted author like Lal and yeah. So yeah, Lal and Dubey. And then in China's case, but again, it was also like during Qing period, it was suspected that overseas Chinese were actually the enemy of the nation, and they were suspected. And again, during Mao Zedong's period, they were thought to be counter-revolutionary. But following reforms and opening up, so that's also in Chinese literature, it's called Xin Qiao or Xin Yimin. So the new literature. So that's the about old diaspora and new diaspora. To the question, what Professor what Poonam Sui said is the religious identity and ethnic identity. Of course, that's a problematic thing in China, and also not only the Uyghur or the other Uyghur or other minority communities, but also in terms of those people who speak Cantonese. And so China also has a Chinese. There's also one Qiu Yanping, Director General of the State Council, was a Overseas Chinese Association office. He said that it was necessary to build a multi-level, wide-ranging and exchange service cooperation platform with overseas Chinese groups, overseas Chinese schools, overseas Chinese media, effectively carry out Xiaowu, which is overseas Chinese. And then again, you mentioned about the 1,000 Talents program, but again, following the outbreak of Wuhan, following the outbreak of coronavirus, so the Harvard University professor who was also invited in Wuhan laboratory, he was also part of that 1,000 Talents program. So and then in 1,000 Talents program, mainly aimed at overseas Chinese who are actually going back to China, actually, which is brain drain. So actually turning into a brain gain, Mr. Xi Jinping. So by the means of more money and so many facilities and services. And in the same, I think in the chat box, Shruti asked the domestic political trends and all this. So how do they play in the diaspora communities approaches? So I think this is also, if we see the homogenization of Chinese people. So Chinese, again, what Poonam Sui said. And again, in India's case, as we see domestically, the rise of Hindutva and also Islamic fundamentalism. So that actually, if we see during Nehruvian, so during Nehru's time, India, to its diaspora community, India has a kind of territorial character. But now it's with the rise of Hindutva and Islamic fundamentalism in homeland, and subsequently among overseas Indians. And again, the global and technological reach of religious organizations such as Vishwa Hindu Parishad and Tabligh Jamaat have apparently resulted in more polarized Indian diaspora. Yeah, so that's it from my side.
Thank you. So we have about 2 or 3 minutes for the others. Could you please come in?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. This is first up. So first, of course, I'd like to respond to the chair's comment. Of course, in the beginning, I have mentioned about the US role, that because China's unique, Taiwan's unique status because of the US role, and that is another debate about the one China policy. And I have mentioned there also, in my paper, that there's a desire for recognition for Taiwan about the US recognition and international recognition about their unique identity. And of course, a lot of interchange between mainland China and Taiwan I talked about the political development and the rise of the DP, democratic, because the identity they stand on the independent issue. So that's why it was divided between the Taiwan and regarding response definitely, there's a desire for internal recognition is always there, and a lot of connection with and movement, United Center, even public funded programs where invite the speakers. So I'd like to read a post from and the main idea behind evolving a rainbow solution, including that from the movement for sexual and gender minorities involving transforming in Taiwan. The movement based on pursuit of self-determination and self-liberation has created a platform for a cosmopolitan identity of Taiwan is true. It was light of sexuality. So definitely there's a desire for a cosmopolitan identity. And last question quickly I saw in the chat box, is there any sexual discrimination in Taiwan? Of course, religious group, there are Christian groups, significant amount of religious population like Christians. So there are anti-gay movement as well. Also the Confucian ideology, that the typical Asian ideology that many people in Asia try to be, they cannot come out from the closeted, despite so much of recognitions and that particular identity. Even in India, you can see, many people, our academic use homophobic. So there are discrimination. But however, the main response of the Taiwan, the gender equitable in out all sexuality and the curriculum in the sex education is included. There are gender neutral general bathrooms, which is still in all private and majority of the public buildings in India. They are it's mainly to stop about bullying and against the homophobia. So their school and education system has done tremendous job, and they are far ahead of other liberal countries like India. So definitely we can learn a lot from Taiwan about their inclusiveness. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. We have exactly another 3 minutes. So may I hand those 3 minutes to Daviru to make her response to all the questions.
Thank you, ma'am. Yes, thank you, ma'am. I will not take much time, and I will straight away go to the comments. Talking about the homogenization, yes, it becomes problematic because when we talk about this thing, it refers to like the reduction of cultural diversity, the space of cultural diversity. So even in the context of China, we can see that, especially when it comes to naming practices. But in the ground reality, if we see, it's very interesting to note that some of the ethnic minorities, they still tend to use their naming patterns, like even the Hua communities, the Mongolians, and even the Tibetans. But one thing which is very interesting to note is that with the introduction of this development of standardized system for inputs of names, which doesn't support many of the ethnic minorities naming patterns. So like the Mongolians, where they have they use these clan names and all. But since the system doesn't support all those kind of inputs, where it is needed for making identity cards, passports, and all, they have to just put cross marks on those documents, all official documents. But at home, they still do use this their ethnic names. And the other thing about the signification and Hanization, when I'm talking about signification, I'm looking more into the concept of Hanization. That means the assimilation of these ethnic groups, culture, language, everything into the majority Han culture. Yes, ma'am. That's I'd like to conclude with these few lines.
Thank you for your generosity in giving us 1 minute to conclude. So may I thank all the presenters and the discussants for raising all these important questions, and both the presenters and the discussants were putting out many questions that I think will stay with us, and hopefully these will go into the next 2 days of this very exciting conference. So let me stop here. Thanks again for inviting me to chair the session. I'm glad to have met all the people who spoke today. And let me hand over to Preksha in case she has any housekeeping announcements to make. Preksha, anything to say? Oops, she's frozen.
Anyway, I just wanted to thank all of you and to congratulate the young scholars for their very interesting papers.
I think Preksha is facing some issues with her audio. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, ma'am.
Let me continue.
Thank you.
So thanks all. I'd like to leave now, please.
Yes, let me conclude this session by thanking the chair, Professor Tejaswini Niranjana, and the discussants, Dr. Poonam Suri and Dr. Rita Agarwal, and the 4 panelists. The video recordings of all our sessions will be available on our ICS YouTube channel. With this, we come to the end of day 1 of the 14th AICCS. We will begin day 2 at 10 a.m. tomorrow with a special panel on the topic Chinese influence in South Asia. Please note that the same meeting link will be valid for all the sessions of the conference. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.